Mark chapter 9. We've been going verse by verse through the Gospel of Mark. And last week, we talked about the transfiguration of Christ, which was a pretty crazy event. You had Peter, James, and John up on the mountain. They fall asleep during their prayer meeting. And when they wake up, Jesus is glowing. His clothes they're so bright, they're described as whiter than white. His face is glowing like the sun. Then you also have Elijah and Moses showing up. It's just, the whole thing's really crazy, really awesome. If you missed that, you can check that out online. And then they come down from the mountain. They have a conversation. And now, but basically, roughly, there's been a 24-hour period by the time we get to what we're looking at now, at least a day. So they've been gone for a day, and they come back down the mountain, and here's what happens next in Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 14. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning with them. Now, if you didn't know or remember, the scribes aren't big fans of Jesus or his disciples. In fact, they're part of the group that's like wanting to figure out how they can get rid of this guy. Let's discredit him, and then let's kill him. Let's get this over with. So Jesus comes down the mountain with Peter, James, and John. He sees the scribes. He sees his other 9 disciples, and they're having an argument. They're having a debate. That word questioning there is actually a stronger word than just questioning. It's 2 groups of people having a debate. It's an argument. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen maybe it's something simple. Maybe it's in a sporting event and you've seen 2 different teams just kind of go at each other. Or you're watching a baseball game and someone gets hit by the pitch and they both come after each other, come off to clear the benches, Jesus comes on the mountain and his 9 disciples are arguing with a group of scribes. This is not a pretty sight. This is an ugly thing to see. They're arguing. Verse 15. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, saluted him. So now you have the crowd all coming over to Jesus, kind of looking to him to see if, well, man, what's going to happen now that Jesus just showed up? Let's see what happens now that Jesus has come. Verse 16, and he asked the scribes, what question ye with them? So Jesus, directing to the scribes, says, what are you arguing with my disciples about? What's the debate? What's the questioning about? What's going on here? Verse 17, and one of the multitude came to him. So one of the multitude, if you look at the other Gospels, you'll see that he came, a certain man came to him kneeling down to him. The other Gospels in Matthew and Luke tell us that he came to him kneeling. He cries out and says, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. So now we're getting a little bit of what's going on here, what this debate's about. What are the scribes arguing with the disciples about? And it has to do with them having attempted to cast out a demon, and it didn't go as planned. Verse 19, Jesus, he answereth him and saith, O faithless or unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. Now, I just quickly want to point out, there's much debate of who he's saying that to. So I'm like, well, he was talking to his disciples because they couldn't cast him out. He was talking to the scribes because they thought whatever they're thinking because they don't like Jesus, all right? Or he was talking to the crowd in general, or he's talking to the Father. But what we'll see in a moment is that in general, the crowd that Jesus came down to, the disciples, the scribes, this Father, none of them at the point he gets down there has any faith that anything's actually going to happen. There's a whole lot of unbelief that Jesus walks into from his disciples, from the scribes, from everybody. There's no expectation of this demon being cast out. And in light of that, Jesus says, oh, faithless, oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. Compare that with other places that Jesus had been, where people were so full of faith, they would just come up and touch him and be healed. But he comes down to this debate about this situation. Verse 20. And when they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. This demonic story, this possession, this demonized young man is much different than all the other stories of Jesus casting out demons. We have many stories of it, even later on in Acts when you have, anyway, there's a diversity of things that happen depending on the situation and the demon involved, all these things. But in this case, hey, bring him to me. And the second that the demon realizes who called him up to the front of this crowd, the demon tears the young man, throws him onto the ground. Like, this is a very violent situation. This is a very disturbing situation. Much different than other situations. 21, verse 21, and he asked his father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. He said, how long has your son been suffering from this? Since he was a kid, since he was a child. That's just a devastating thing to hear and to know about. See, here's everyone debating and questioning. Everyone's kind of forgot about the father and his son who's been dealing with this for a very long time. Verse 22, he went on to say, and oft times it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So, gets thrown on the ground, and then he's been dealing with this since he was a child. In fact, this evil spirit has tried getting him to be thrown into the water so he might drown, or into a fire that he might burn. Like, this is a very violent, evil, demonic presence. And he says, if you can, please help us. If you can, help us. So I have to point out, what he asks is much different than what other people have asked. He very specifically says, if you can. So like I already mentioned, Jesus walks down this mountain. There's not a lot of faith going on. And even this man who went to the disciples, he says, well, if you can do anything. To Jesus, who's already cast out many demons, who's already healed many people, who's already shown what authority that he has, if you can do something. I mean, this is kind of an interesting statement. If you look at other stories, earlier in Mark chapter 1, we read about a leper who came to Jesus, and he said, if thou wilt, thou can make me clean. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand, touched him, and said unto him, I will, be thou clean. So the leper didn't say, hey, if you can. He said, if you're willing to. I know you can do it. The question is, will you do it? But he knew that he could. Or how about even Jesus talking to the Father? Jesus said to the Father, leading up to his death on the cross, he says, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine will be done. Jesus knew the Father had the ability to change the outcome. It wasn't about ability. It had to do with the willingness or the situation at hand. Or what about other scripture that we have from James 4:14, where it teaches us that, whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It's even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away. For you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or do that. So like even just our daily lives that we live in, we know God can do all kinds of things. But even just living this day, it's a matter of, if he willeth. And 1 John 5:14 says, this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he heareth us. You see, the leper, he knows Jesus can heal him. He has faith that Jesus can heal him. He simply asks, will you heal me? Jesus knows the Father can stop the crucifixion from happening, but he asks if he will. James and John teach us that even if we have incredible faith, incredible confidence, whether it's living out our daily life or bringing a prayer request to God, it will always be a question of God's will, not a question of God's ability. Not a question of God's ability. Mike Winger, a Bible teacher, said, faith is essential, but it's not a guaranteed result because it is God's will that we're asking for here. So in this story, the son's father says to Jesus, if you can, implying he does not know if Jesus can do it. He's not implying a question of God's will, but is implying a question of God's ability. Verse 23 has Jesus' response. Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. So the guy says, if you can help him, and Jesus says, if you can believe, he kind of puts it right back on him. It's like, listen, I can do it, but can you believe that I can do it? He turns the phrase right back to the man. He responds to the man's statement of if you can do it with if you can believe it's possible. Jesus turns the man's implication of questioning Jesus' ability into an implied question of the man's ability to believe. For us this morning, I want to phrase it this way. Jesus can do it. Can you believe it? When we did our series on prayer for 5 weeks, we talked about one of the biggest roadblocks to a praying life is cynicism. In other words, we don't pray for miracles because maybe we don't truly believe that God answers prayer and performs miracles. God can. Do you believe it? He might say no to things that you believe he should say yes to. Amen? The question is not, God can do it. Will he do it? We often can't know the answer to that. But the question is, God can do it. Can you believe it? Let's not question God's ability. That being said, I have to address something about verse 23. I'm going to read it one more time. Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. This verse has been abused and misused by so many people. You've got to be careful. There have been people who've claimed that the only thing in the way between a miraculous healing or that money that you need is faith. And that if you don't get healed, or your loved one doesn't get healed, or you don't have some kind of Western culture breakthrough moment, it's because you didn't have enough faith. And keep in mind, faith is essential. We're called to have faith and trust in God. And Jesus is looking in this situation for someone to have, does anybody have any faith in this entire crowd? Jesus desires for us to trust him, to have faith in him. While it is essential in the Christian life to have faith, this type of teaching, to say that, that happened because of not having enough faith, that kind of teaching leaves out the matter of God's what? God's will. So this text is about God's ability. It's not about God's will. It leaves out the fact that the Apostle Paul prayed for a miracle and God told him no. It leaves out the fact that Paul told Timothy to drink some wine for his stomach's sake. Why didn't he say, if you had enough faith, you wouldn't have that stomach problem? This type of teaching implies that any Christian in history who suffered from a disease or persecution or poverty must have lacked having the right amount of faith. That teaching is unbiblical. It's an unbiblical approach, and it's an unbalanced teaching about faith. When I address that being a problem, I'm not throwing out faith when I talk about it. I'm just saying that is a misteaching, an unbiblical presentation, an unbalanced teaching about faith. See, because faith is about trusting God. Trusting in his ability. Believing that God can. That's a major theme that the text that we're in is addressing. But faith is also about trusting God's will. Faith is trusting that God is all-powerful and surrendering what we think should happen for what God knows needs to happen. So we need to be able to pray boldly. We need to be able to pray and seek God, believing that He can, and at the same time, in faith, surrender to whatever He decides to do with His ability. So I have to say this. On the flip side, maybe that's not you. You know that God's not required to do anything. Maybe we all know that already in the room. We know that God's not a genie in a lamp, and because I have great faith, He's going to do what I want Him to do. Maybe you have the opposite problem. Maybe, and myself as well, maybe I see situations and think God can't change this. God can't change this. See the difference there? Not God won't. God can't do this. You see someone's life and you think it's too late for that person. It's too late for this situation. God can't even turn this around. That's also wrong thinking. That's also wrong thinking. And sometimes there's a really fine line between saying, I know God can, but Willie, there's a fine line that we kind of play with sometimes of like, oh yeah, I believe He can. Right? And so we got to be careful. We can play mind tricks on ourselves there. Will God do fill in the blank? I don't know. I don't have that answer for you. Can God do fill in the blank? Yes. God can do it. Can we believe that? Can we believe that? Once again, verse 23, Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. Verse 24, and straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. So he goes from, if you can, to Jesus explaining, well, hey, can you believe? Well, you know what? Yes, I can believe. Can you help the part of me that doesn't believe? And I love this verse because we can all relate to this verse. We've all been in situations, we've all faced things. We're like, well, I know God can do it, but part of me wonders about that. Part of me is unbelieving. But if you notice, something has changed, right? Jesus came down the mountain. There's no faith present anywhere. But during this dialogue, all of a sudden, we see a tiny little speck of faith starting to appear in this father. I believe, at least a little bit. Can you help the part of me that doesn't believe? In a minute, you're going to see that Jesus is going to help his son. He doesn't wait for the man's faith to come all the way through. He doesn't wait for the man to believe the rest of the way. But I tell you one thing, after what happens, this man's faith grew by leaps and bounds after. In the other Gospels, we'll see that Jesus talks about faith as a mustard seed. I posted a picture of a mustard seed on social media yesterday. I was going to bring one with me, but I kept dropping it. Which, side note, don't know if Jesus was trying to imply this at all, but when I was trying to take the picture yesterday, it kept rolling out of my hand, and I had to keep getting another one because I couldn't find. So there's probably a bunch of mustard seeds on my floor somewhere. I was thinking how fragile and easy it was to lose. And I think that applies to our faith as well, and why we have to guard our faith and fight for our faith. But if we nurture that, if you plant that thing in the ground in good soil and take care of that thing, it'll turn into some ridiculously massive bush tree thing with branches and birds in it and stuff. All right, so that's what maybe our faith can become. Anyway, I'm speculating. That's for free. It fell out of my hand, and that's what I thought. That was not Bible. That was just me talking. So you just discredit all of that. Okay, all right. Help thou mine unbelief. A lot of us live right there. Help me with my doubt. You know, our very first gathering as a church family, a week before our dedication Sunday, on October 10th, we talked about doubt. You guys were there. We talked about doubt. We talked about how we should not put people down, because of their doubt. But we also talked about how we need to confess our doubt to God. In other words, you need to be honest. You need to be honest about your doubt, but realize that you don't have to stay there. That God doesn't want you to stay there. So while the Father in this story is honest about his doubt, he also asked Jesus for help not to stay there. He's like, you know what? I have a little ounce of faith now. Help me with the part of me that doesn't believe. Help me with my unbelief. So with this man's little bit of faith and Jesus' will to act, here is what happens next. Verse 25. Jesus saw that the people came running together. All right, so what that means is, so some of the crowd came over, whether it was the scribes and the disciples and some others, but there were still people coming over. So during this big thing, they saw that Jesus was about to do something and they were running over. And as this crowd is starting to grow and as people are coming over, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him and enter no more into him. He doesn't just cast the demon out. He tells the demon, you can't come back. Whoa. This is also unique to this story. He's like, not only do I cast you out, you can't have this young man anymore. You can't come back. Verse 26, and the spirit cried and rent him sore. So keep in mind, brought him up, this evil spirit threw him to the ground. Then Jesus cast the demon out, says you can't come back. And the demon on his way out hurts the man again. Like, this is such a wild, wild story that on his way out, on his way obeying the authority of Jesus, he like gets one more kick in there. You know, it's kind of like when my kids are fighting and it's like, okay, no more hitting. Okay. All right, so that's kind of what's going on. He tells the demon, you're out of here and you can't come back. And then he leaves. I mean, this demon is a tough one. Like, this is evil, demonic. And came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, he is dead. So he has been torn and hurt physically so much by this demon that by the time the demon leaves, his body just drops to the ground. Corpse-like. Everyone's like, no one's celebrating yet, by the way. Jesus tells the demon to get out, and the boy plops on the ground, and everybody's like, oh, he's dead. This went really well. He's a goner. But verse 27, but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So Jesus not only casts the demon out of him, he then heals his body of all the damage that had been done by this demon. In the other Gospels, you can read that Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the child that very hour and delivered him again to his father. So he casts out the demon, heals the child, and brings him back to his dad. And I guarantee you that mustard seed faith began to grow a little bit. So here's what happens next. We're at the very end of the story. Verse 28, and when he was coming to the house, the disciples asked him privately. Okay, so they go into this house. Disciples go and want to ask him a question about what just happened. Now, the way my mind works, I'm realizing that Peter, James, and John was with Jesus up on the mountain when this happened. And when they came down and saw this mess and said they couldn't cast him out, I can almost see Peter, James, and John kind of standing by Jesus and not by the other 12 saying, oh, well, we weren't here. Don't look at us. We were up on the mountain seeing something really cool, but we can't tell you about that either. So they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves. They ask him, they go into the house, they ask him, why could not we cast him out? Seems like a fair question. Like, Jesus, why couldn't we cast him out? Here's the reason why it's a good question. Because if you guys remember, just 3 chapters ago, In Mark 6, Jesus gave the 12 disciples special authority over all evil spirits. And then they went out and cast out a whole bunch of evil spirits. And then they went and told Jesus how awesome it was. We went out and cast all these demons out and healed people and preached the gospel. It was awesome. And then they went to rest. Then Jesus is up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John. Meanwhile, down the mountain, the other disciples are brought this demonized young man and apparently invoked the special authority that Jesus gave them to attempt to cast out the demon, just like they had done before. But nothing happened. And that's about all we know about that situation. You can speculate all day. All we know is that he gave them authority to do it. They try casting this one out. This one doesn't leave. Why could we not do it? We've done it before. Why couldn't we cast him out? Verse 29 says, and he said unto them, this kind come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. Now, it would be an injustice if I didn't include the parallel passage in Matthew, which gives a little more dialogue to what Jesus said. Even though I do think that's the main emphasis of what Jesus tells them, he said more than that. In Matthew 17, in verse 19, it says, then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, why could not we cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, which, by the way, that's a phrase that would have been common, a normal thing to say at the time. We say a grain of sand, a grain of salt. At their time, it would have been a normal phrase to use. Like, man, that thing is as small as a grain of mustard seed. If you would have had faith as a mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Once again, he's not saying that they're going to go around moving mountains. That's also a phrase. I can't think of a modern one that we use when you do something impossible. But he's saying you'll be able to do things that normally would be impossible, but they won't be. The Matthew passage here gives us this insight. It implies that at some point in this given situation, that the 9 disciples collectively no longer believed that God could rid this young man of this demon by the authority that Jesus had given them. We don't know if the unbelief occurred before they first attempted to cast the demon out or if it happened after. But by the time Jesus had got down from the mountain, there was not any faith. There was arguments, there was fanfare, there was questions of Jesus' abilities, but no faith initially. So he first tells them, basically, he's implying here, it was possible. Why couldn't we do it? Well, it was possible with their unique and special God-given authority to cast out that demon, but they had already ruled out what God had not willed out. I don't know when that happened, but at some point in this situation, the disciples who had this special authority from Jesus himself to cast out demons had ruled out what God had not willed out. But then, verse 21 of the Matthew text, but it'll be the same in here, is, howbeit, however, that being said, this kind of demon goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. So while their God-given authority was still available to them, it's not like they had lost that authority that he had given to them. This demon was not like the previous demons that they had cast out before. This demonic presence would have to be faced with more prayer and possibly even fasting prayer. So while the disciples had given up, Jesus is teaching them that in this situation, it required more prayer. But at that point, they'd already lost their faith, so why would they even pray? This is the same theme of this whole text. I believe God can, but really, at this point, they ruled out God's ability to help this young man. So why would they keep praying? So what does this last part of this story mean for us? Well, before we can talk about doubting God's ability to cast out demons or about praying and fasting over extra difficult evil situations or demons, we might need to address the fact that maybe many of us actually don't believe in demonic possession or oppression. We just think those are some old stories in the Bible, or maybe we think it's just how they socially viewed things or whatever. But maybe some of us don't believe that there's evil spirits at work in the world, that there's spiritual warfare. Now, I want to be careful. I don't want to swerve off the road here. Okay? Some people make the mistake of that everything is demonic. Everything's an evil spirit. I remember meeting someone at a church one time, and the whole conversation was, and then the devil did this, and then the devil did that, and then the devil did this, and then, then my car broke down, and it was the devil, and then, and then I stubbed my toe, and it was the devil. And I'm like, oh man, this guy giving the devil way too much credit. The devil, he did it all. Okay, we don't want to swerve off into that road where everything is the devil, okay? Not everything is a demon. You got pulled over on your way to the church gathering because you were speeding, not because the devil didn't want you to be at church, okay? You have a stomach ache because you stayed up late eating junk food, not because you're being demonically oppressed. Okay? So I want to bring these clarities to this conversation. So from being late to work all the way to suffering from an illness, much of that is just summed up as part of life. But let's not overcorrect the other way, like so many people do, and make the mistake of assuming there is no demonic, there is no evil spirits at work. But that's not the case either. If we don't believe that there is demonic activity at work, we won't be trusting Jesus and praying to fight against it. That should concern us that we won't even consider something to be spiritual warfare if we're not aware that it's there. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil as a roaring lion walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world." He's saying the devil's at work, and you got to resist it with your faith. Ephesians 4:26, "Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil." How about Ephesians 6:11? It says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." And James 4:7, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Well, how are you supposed to resist something that you don't think is there? If we're going to guard our faith, we must be prepared to fight a spiritual warfare. If we're going to protect and guide our families, we must be prepared to fight a spiritual warfare. If we as a church, if we want to push against evil and the demonic and be a bright light in our community, we must be prepared to fight a spiritual warfare. Does this mean that we sit back and pray and don't do anything? Like, I'm just going to pray. It's just a spiritual warfare. I'm just going to sit back. No, of course not. Faith without works is what? Dead. Faith leads to action. Faith leads to action. When we see evil out in the world, we respond to that by bringing light to that given situation. We meet those needs. We push against it. What I'm saying is that a major part of our action should include acknowledging the demonic, believing that Jesus has all authority, and praying specifically in regards to whatever situation calls for it. So, I'm not just going to reach out and be that helping hand. I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to pray. I'm also going to fast. I'm also going to ask God, but hey God, there seems to be an evil presence in this situation. It's not just that these evil things are happening and we're trying to fight against that. There seems to be an evil spirit at work in this situation. So we're going to pray as if there's also spiritual warfare, not just the physical things that we can see. If the disciples would have been believing instead of unbelieving, it seems that the situation still would have called for fasting and prayer. See, sometimes we try to overcome an evil thing or an evil presence one time, and when it doesn't work, we give up. Oh, God must not want to do anything with this. Or, oh, I tried. What if instead of giving up like the disciples did with this demon, what if instead it caused us to be steadfast in prayer and fasting, to fight harder against the darkness? I've said little on this really this morning because, and just in general, because I know little on this and I want to be careful. I don't want to create weird theologies about things. But I know this, that evil forces are at work. And I know that Jesus has all authority over such evil forces. Therefore, I should be moved to action, be strong in faith, and fast and pray as much as necessary to overcome the spiritual darkness. So may we as individuals, as families, as a church, fight the spiritual warfare against the evil, against the darkness, as we physically, in person, go and make a difference in people's lives. Let's also pray. As we are raising up our kids in godly homes, let's also pray over their souls. As we are going through our journey in life, may we pray and seek God and resist the devil. So whether it's about our faith or demons in this very fun text today, may we see what God has for us and how we can learn and grow from that today.